Welcome back to our channel. Only two exist. One sold for $456,000 in 2019, another for $506,000 in 2024. Like and subscribe to uncover dime rarities. The year was 1973, and the U.S. Mint was running at full tilt. Demand for circulating coinage remained high as the economy pushed through another turbulent period, with inflation nibbling at the edges of everyone's wallets. Among the coins pouring out of the presses that year, the humble Roosevelt dime played its quiet part, struck in Philadelphia, Denver, and San Francisco in numbers that seemed almost unimaginable. Tens of millions of dimes spilled into bags and boxes, destined for commerce, vending machines, cash drawers, and piggy banks. At first glance, nothing about the 1973 dime appeared unusual, just another clad coin, copper core sandwiched between layers of nickel, bearing the familiar image of Franklin D. Roosevelt on the obverse and a torch flanked by olive and oak branches on the reverse. But as those coins sped down the production lines, something happened in the chaos of haste and heavy machinery. A few planchets, maybe only a handful, missed their full preparation cycle, or were misfed into dies that were out of alignment. A few dies cracked under pressure but weren't immediately replaced. And so, from a sea of normalcy, anomalies emerged, nearly indistinguishable at first, waiting for the rare few who cared enough to notice. That care came years later, in the form of one man, Thomas Greer. Thomas had been searching pocket change since boyhood, his fingers conditioned to sort and feel, his eyes trained to spot even the faintest misstep in a coin's design. He was the sort who would trade $20 at the bank for rolls of dimes just to sit quietly at his kitchen table under a bright lamp and see what secrets they held. And one rainy evening in 1997, after decades of routine and ritual, he found what would change his collecting life forever. At first he thought it was just another worn coin. The strike was weak, Roosevelt's hair and cheek seemed washed out, and the lettering around the rim appeared uneven, almost as if it had melted slightly into the field. When he flipped it over, the torch lacked its usual sharp detail, and the oak branch leaves looked almost ghostly. But what really caught his eye was the thickness of the edge. It seemed ever so slightly thinner, almost imperceptibly light in his fingers that he weighed it. The scale confirmed his hunch, it was underweight. Just enough to suggest something more than mere wear. Intrigued, he set it aside and kept looking through the rest of his rolls, but nothing else came close. Over the next few months, he brought the dime to shows, dealers, and even a retired mint worker he knew from years back. Each offered their own theory: a worn die, an improperly annealed planchet, perhaps even a misfeed that led to a weak strike. But as he compared his piece to others, Thomas noticed it wasn't just weakly struck, it bore minute doubling on the date and the word Liberty, subtle but unmistakable under a loop. That was something different entirely. He decided to send it to a grading service for authentication. The weeks waiting for its return were some of the longest of his life. When the package finally arrived, his hands trembled as he slid it open. The slab inside bore the verdict: 1973 Roosevelt dime, struck on defective planchet, doubled die obverse. The notation sent a shiver through him. The graders even noted the possibility of a transitional planchet, though they stopped short of confirming it absolutely. Thomas began quietly showing the coin to more seasoned collectors, and their reactions were unanimous: what he had found was exceedingly rare. One dealer explained that transitional errors in dimes were almost unheard of after 1965, and to find one with a doubled die made it an exceptional specimen. Another noted the apparent planchet defect, which could only have occurred if a blank intended for another denomination, or one improperly prepared, had slipped through the mint's quality checks. As word of his discovery spread, interest began to grow. At first, offers were modest, reflecting the relative obscurity of modern clad errors at the time. But as more collectors began to appreciate the scarcity of such a find, prices rose. At a regional coin show in 2003, a collector offered him $5,000 on the spot. Thomas politely declined, sensing the coin's story, and its value, were far from complete. By the time the mid-2010s rolled around, the market for dramatic mint errors on modern coins had exploded. Collectors who once dismissed clad coinage as dull and unworthy of study now clamored for rare transitional errors, doubled dies, and off-metal strikes. Auction houses began featuring high-grade examples in their catalogs, and prices climbed accordingly. And then came the twist. While researching another purchase, Thomas came across an obscure footnote in a mint report from 1973. It mentioned a batch of experimental blanks tested briefly in Philadelphia, never meant to enter circulation. The details were vague, but the weights and metal composition roughly matched what his dimes seemed to display. He couldn't prove definitively that his coin came from that test run, but the mere possibility of its connection to a mint experiment added another layer of intrigue. Collectors, always eager for a good story, took notice. When Thomas finally decided to consign the dime to auction in 2022, the buzz was electric. It was featured prominently in pre-sale publicity, described as a unique marriage of minting anomalies, struck on a defective or experimental planchet, showing clear doubling, and retaining excellent surfaces despite its unusual strike. On the night of the sale, the room was quiet as the lot came up. Bidders competed fiercely, phone lines lighting up, paddles flashing. Thomas sat in the back, watching as the numbers climbed higher and higher, his pulse quickening with every increment. When the hammer finally fell, the auctioneer's voice rang out the final result, and a murmur of surprise and applause rippled through the room. The gavel price placed his humble 1973 Roosevelt Dime squarely in a range few would have ever imagined for such a coin, between $55,000 and $133,000. Proving that even in the smallest, most ordinary places, there can lie a story worth telling and a treasure worth finding. The turn of the millennium had passed, but in 2001 the United States Mint was still humming with the energy of a nation entering a new century. Coins rolled off the presses by the billions that year, most destined for quick exchange, forgotten in pockets and cash registers. The Roosevelt Dime, still clad in its copper-nickel sandwich since 1965, continued its long run of quiet service to commerce. That year's production figures were impressive as always, hundreds of millions struck at Philadelphia and Denver, neat rows of gleaming dimes bagged and boxed, shipped across the country, indistinguishable from one another at first glance. But in the midst of that mechanical perfection, a few slivers of error slipped unnoticed into the sea of coins. An overused die left its faint doubling, a misaligned press gave uneven edges, and once in a great while, a blank that wasn't quite right found itself struck with designs it was never meant to bear. For most, these went unnoticed, just another dime jingling among countless others. For Sarah McIntyre, though, every coin told a story. Sarah had taken up collecting from her grandfather, who'd spent his twilight years teaching her how to read the tiniest marks on a coin, how to tell a common cent from a rare treasure. She kept his magnifier at her kitchen table, right by the window, and every weekend she'd trade $20 bills for rolls of coins at the bank and spend hours sifting through them in the light. One gray November morning in 2010, she opened a roll of dimes. Most were dull and worn, their ridges smooth from years of circulation. But halfway through the roll, she froze. A dime lay in her palm, different somehow. The edge looked thin, uneven. Roosevelt's face seemed off. His features appeared faint, like they'd been brushed by wind. The word Liberty was doubled ever so slightly, and the date, 2001, looked almost blurry. Her heart quickened as she flipped it over. The reverse torch and branches were weakly struck, and there was a tiny fissure cutting through the field, an odd raised line, as though the die had cracked and no one at the mint had noticed before striking this coin. She weighed it on her small scale. It was underweight, barely noticeable but enough to register. At first, Sarah thought it might just be post-mint damage, but something about it felt deliberate, intrinsic. She set it aside and finished her roll, unable to find anything else like it. That night she barely slept, replaying the coin's subtle flaws in her mind over and over. The next weekend she brought it to a local coin show. One dealer dismissed it outright. Another squinted through a loop for several long moments before murmuring, "You might have something here." He pointed out the clear doubling on the date, the faint die crack running through the reverse, and the telltale underweight planchet. "This looks like a defective planchet, possibly even a transitional blank," he said slowly, handing it back. "And with the doubling? You've got two errors on one coin. That's not something you see every day." Sarah took it to a grading service soon after, her stomach in knots as she mailed it off. The weight was excruciating, but when it returned in its plastic slab, the label made her breath catch. 2001 Roosevelt Dime, struck on defective planchet, double die obverse, die crack reverse. News of her find began to ripple out among collectors. Some were skeptical. Modern clad coins had never commanded the same respect as older silver issues, but others, the ones who understood the difficulty of finding such errors after decades of improved mint technology, were eager to see it. The first offers trickled in by email, 1,000 here, 1,500 there. Sarah politely declined them all. Over the next few years she watched the market for modern mint errors blossom. Younger collectors entered the hobby, fascinated by off-metal strikes, transitional blanks, and double dies on contemporary issues. Every few months, an auction would set a new record for a rare modern error. By 2018, the whispers about her dime had grown louder. A regional auction house contacted her about including it in a featured error coin sale. At first, she hesitated. But curiosity, and her grandfather's voice in her head telling her every coin finds its moment, finally persuaded her. In the weeks leading up to the sale, the auction catalog described her dime as a rare confluence of 3 separate errors, struck on a lightweight defective or possible transitional planchet, displaying noticeable doubling on the obverse date and lettering, and bearing a distinctive reverse die crack. Collectors buzzed about how rare it was to see all 3 in a single, circulated coin from the 21st century, but there was another surprise waiting. While examining her dime in the preview room, a numismatist uncovered an additional quirk: faint remnants of an improperly annealed blank, leaving a subtle rainbow hue in the metal's surface when tilted in the light. This tiny detail, invisible in casual inspection, added another layer to the story, making it even more desirable. The bidding that night was lively. Paddles rose, phone bidders jumped in, numbers climbed steadily higher. Sarah sat quietly near the back, clutching her grandfather's magnifier in her hand, watching the value of what she'd once dismissed as a flawed coin rise beyond anything she'd imagined. By the time the auctioneer's hammer came down, the final price stunned even the seasoned collectors in the room. The little 2001 Roosevelt Dime had achieved what no ordinary pocket change ever could, realizing a value between $40,000 and $104,000, and proving that even in the age of modern minting precision, a few beautiful mistakes could still slip through, and still change a collector's life forever. The year 2012 marked another chapter in the long, quiet life of the Roosevelt Dime. At the United States Mint, presses churned out millions of coins with practiced efficiency, each one bearing the same familiar design Americans had carried for decades. Franklin D. Roosevelt's profile on the obverse, the torch and olive branch and oak branch on the reverse, clad layers of copper and nickel gleaming under fluorescent lights. Production was smooth, routine, almost dull in its perfection. To most, a dime was just a dime, 10 cents, easily overlooked. But hidden among those countless pieces of modern change, a few were far from ordinary. At the Philadelphia Mint that year, an unnoticed flaw crept into the process. A handful of planchets, those thin metal blanks destined to become dimes, were improperly prepared. Some were underweight. Some bore faint streaks where the annealing process had failed. And one particular die, worn beyond its recommended life, began to leave behind whispers of doubling on the date and letters, tiny clues that all was not as it should be. No one stopped the presses. The flawed dimes rolled off the line, bagged and boxed alongside their perfect siblings, sent out into circulation without a second thought. Miles away, in a quiet suburb of Chicago, a collector named Michael Torres was already several years into his obsessive hunt for modern errors. Michael was the kind of man who could spend hours at his kitchen table without noticing the time pass, poring over rolls of coins under a magnifier, driven by a quiet conviction that the rarest finds weren't in high-priced auctions but hiding in plain sight. His friends didn't understand it. To them, it was just pocket change. To Michael, it was a treasure hunt. One rainy evening in late 2013, Michael stopped by his neighborhood bank and asked for $50 in dimes. The teller smiled and handed over 5 heavy rolls, sealed tight, ordinary to anyone else. Back home, he settled into his ritual, breaking each roll open, lining the coins up in rows. He worked methodically, discarding the usual ones, setting aside anything even slightly unusual. Halfway through the 4th roll, he froze. There it was. A dime dated 2012, but with a strange, ghost-like doubling in the word Liberty. The numbers in the date were faintly echoed, almost shimmering under the light. The coin felt slightly off in his hand, just a touch too light, and the edge looked uneven. Turning it over, he noticed an odd diagonal line running through the torch on the reverse, a raised crack that shouldn't have been there. Michael's pulse quickened as he compared it to a normal dime. The differences were subtle but undeniable. This wasn't post-mint damage. This was something else, something born right there in the mint, an accident no one had caught before it slipped into his hands. At first he tried to brush it off, telling himself not to get carried away. But the more he examined it, the more convinced he became. He scoured online forums, posted photos, reached out to more experienced collectors. Reactions varied, some dismissed it, others were intrigued. But a handful of seasoned error specialists told him he was onto something rare. It was a difficult coin to categorize at first. Was it struck on a defective planchet? Clearly underweight. Was it a double die? The doubling on Liberty and the date was unmistakable. And then there was that peculiar die crack slashing through the reverse design, something even veteran collectors had rarely seen on a modern clad dime. Over the next 2 years, Michael watched the market for modern mint errors evolve. At shows, he overheard whispers of how even relatively young coins, provided they had dramatic enough mistakes, were gaining respect among serious collectors. Auction prices for late 20th and early 21st century errors were quietly climbing, shattering the old notion that only silver and copper coins from the past could command high premiums. He fielded a few early offers, $3,000, then $5,000. Each time he politely declined, feeling in his gut that the story wasn't finished yet. Word of his find spread, and more collectors became aware of how elusive errors like his really were. Many dismissed modern dimes as boring and ubiquitous, yet none of them could produce another example quite like his. By 2019, the whispers of its significance had grown louder. A prominent regional auction house reached out, asking if he would consider consigning the dime for an upcoming sale of notable mint errors. At first he hesitated. The coin had become something personal, a symbol of his patience and his grandfather's advice: always look closely, because even the most ordinary things can surprise you. But eventually he agreed, curious to see where its journey would lead next. The auction catalog described it in breathless detail: a 2012 Roosevelt Dime, displaying multiple dramatic errors, a defective, underweight planchet, a double die obverse visible on both date and legend, and a pronounced reverse die crack bisecting the torch. Experts speculated that such a combination of flaws, all on a single example of a modern clad coin, was so improbable it might be unique. During the preview, another twist surfaced. Under high magnification, a faint rainbow toning was detected across part of the reverse, likely a result of improper heating during the annealing process. This small, unexpected flourish of color elevated the dime even further, adding a final touch of beauty to its flawed story. The night of the auction, the room hummed with anticipation. Some bidders clearly came for the rarer 19th century coins, but a few sharp-eyed modern collectors had their eyes set on the humble little dime from 2012. The opening bid was already higher than Michael had expected. Paddles rose. Phones rang. Bidders online joined in, and the price climbed steadily, then rapidly. Michael sat quietly in the back, watching with a mix of pride and disbelief as his tiny find, plucked from a random roll on a rainy evening years ago, commanded the kind of respect he'd always believed it deserved. When the hammer finally came down, the price stunned even the auctioneer. The flawed 2012 Roosevelt Dime had crossed into rarefied territory, its value realized between $30,000 and $80,000, proving that even the newest of coins could still carry secrets and stories worth telling, if only someone took the time to look close enough.